I'd like to call this public hearing to order. Roll call, please.
Present.
Here.
Present.
Here. The purpose of this public hearing is to hear testimony and discuss the following. The capital budget. We have a sign-in sheet here. No one signed in that I'm aware of concerning the capital budget, public hearing on the capital budget. We did have the mayor come in with the business administrator approximately 2 weeks ago to discuss the capital budget. As I said, there were no speakers who signed in. Is there anyone that would like to be heard on the capital budget? Okay, if there's no further business, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
This public hearing is adjourned. Thank you. Speakers here at Caucus tonight. We have our fire chief, Judge, who's going to kind of give us a brief on the flooding which recently occurred and how the city has been working to address those issues. Chief Judge, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Council. So I'll just start by saying we're still progressing through some of the initial damage assessments. Most of them have been done. The public assistance projects, which basically impact our critical infrastructure, those have all been completed at this point as far as the engineering assessment, and they've been forwarded to the county to be put in what they call the damage assessment tool, which PEMA can then see and which will be forwarded to FEMA eventually. I did receive notice today that the county will be doing what they call a joint PDA. It's a joint public damage assessment, and that'll be beginning on Thursday. Teams from FEMA and PEMA and the county will be in and meeting with local municipal officials, myself, the city engineer, the DPW director, be several other people from the city visiting the different areas that were impacted by the flood and taking a look at the different rivers and streams that, dumped a lot of debris into our neighborhoods. So that's scheduled for Thursday. At this point, we anticipate that that's going to be a full day. Hopefully we'll be able to get to all the sites in that full day and then move from there. As far as the individual assistance goes, the city did some outreach events to make sure that we were getting in touch with different residents and getting their information into a similar tool that PEMA uses to do individual assessments. Those were successful. We had a couple hundred people come through the city, and then they had, I'm sure you saw the coverage on it, but the county, along with PEMA and other agencies, had the MARC events, the multiple agency coordination centers, our resource centers up at Chinchilla's fire station up in South Abington Township. And the city had representatives from code enforcement, from the fire department, and also OECD, I believe, were there as well, to walk some neighbors through try and answer some of the questions. A lot of those questions we can't answer yet until FEMA and PEMA come in and do their damage assessments and walk those projects with us. But we were, I don't know what the right word is, but we were glad to see so many people engaged in that because those numbers are important. That's how FEMA and PEMA determine if PEMA determines if they're going to ask the federal government for assistance, individual assistance. I think we're going to meet the threshold for the public assistance projects. That's the hope. There's a $23 million threshold that the municipalities need to reach, and that all that information has been forwarded up to the county at this point. I think we estimated in the city it was close to $5 to $6 million. That was just our initial high-level damage assessments that we worked on with the engineers, and those are just on our projects. That's not individual homes. Code enforcement continues to do work as far as processing permits if it's practical to do so. We have to be very careful with which permits that they do put out based on how much damage was done on those homes. And the reason we have to do that is we have to follow our flood management ordinances, or we risk being put on probation or suspension from the National Flood Insurance Program. To date, from last numbers I have, from August 28th or 29th of 2020, or 23, just about a month ago, we had 305 policies in force in the city. Those policies, if we do not follow the NFIP as far as permitting goes, are in risk of getting assessed by the National Flood Insurance Program if we fail to follow those protocols and those guidelines that are set forth and ultimately adopted by ordinance, which that's the only way you can get flood insurance in the nation, if you adopt those policies and follow those guidelines regarding issuing permits. So we've had contractors out between NEIC and Barry Isaacs doing damage assessments on individual properties and doing outreach with those homeowners that had substantial damage to their property to see what type of threshold it is, because those will dictate how we will proceed forward with whether they're able to be issued permits or whether they're going to have to do substantial improvements to the home that might not be feasible to actually do it because of the cost. So that's where we're at. We're going very cautiously with that. In the last several years, a major flooding that occurred in Luzerne County, one of the townships, because they were issuing permits, was put on suspension by the NFIP. And it took them 5 years to unring that bell, and people down there were assessed. People that might not have been impacted by the flood, but had national insurance, national flood insurance through the program. So we're being very mindful of that, and we hope that the public damage assessment, that joint PDA that will be happening this week and possibly into next week, that we'll have additional information for the residents and to begin some of these long-term mitigation projects, essentially. We are actively doing, DPW is out there, and when contractors are out in our floodways, opening up those streams back up in case something does happen. We're also taking care of the Merrifield Avenue pump station. There was another issue there the other night. It went down probably sometime overnight, but by 7 o'clock, DPW was back on it, and we've channeled some additional resources into that area where we'll be able to monitor that going forward. I know the DPW director, we were in constant communication over the weekend with the mayor, the police chief, the DPW director to monitor the status of our, our different streams and tributaries that go through here. Yes?
Ask you a quick
Sure.
question. May I ask you a quick question about the pump station? So it seemed to have failed the other day. I know everybody doesn't want to hear that word, it failed, but what's the problem with it? We never got an assessment back from the city engineers who were supposed to take a look at it, but it appears that it didn't work the other night, and you said they got it up and running, so what seems to be the problem with it?
So the initial night of the flooding would be because the Lindy Creek went over. So Lindy Creek probably dumped several million gallons of runoff into that area, which since I've been here, the 21 years I've been here, I've never seen the Lindy Creek do that. That pump station's not designed for it because of where the electrical panels are located in there. When I got on scene there shortly after, probably, I lost track of time, but 9 or 9:30 that night, it was almost up to the roof line of that pump station. So the electrical would fail at that point. The pumps were not able to keep up. Once DPW flood control was able to get that water all the way down to a level where they can get in there and assess them, North End Electric removed those pumps. They baked them, they checked them, and then Urban Electric redid the whole electrical panel. It seems the other day that one of the belts failed on the pump. They were initially running. We've talked to some residents in the area. They were able to hear them. We think they probably shut off sometime overnight. And all the water that's coming down from Kaiser Creek, which normally floods that area, was starting to build up. And when the flood control people got in from DPW the next day, they began pumping them out again. And once they were able to get it down to a safe level where they can get in there, they looked at the other pump. One of the belts had to be changed. They changed that belt. So we're looking at long-term solutions, and I know the engineer is looking at that. But That's not something that we're going to be able to throw up overnight, so what they're doing is they're looking to make sure that that pump continues to run. So the city is looking to install 2 cameras. I believe IT might have been out there today, 2 cameras that will look at that pump station and that the police department will be able to monitor. And we're also looking at what they call a transducer, which will send a signal or a automated telephone call. We're still looking to see where that call is going to go. I believe either police headquarters or to the comm center to alert them that the pump has shut off or that it's turned on. So each time it turns on or shuts off, we could have PD or the fire department go over, look, see if water's starting to back up, and then make sure that we get it addressed beforehand. But we did have the contractors out there. They resurfaced those pumps the first time, and they've been back out there the second time. So we're looking at some alternative solutions to see if the pumps just need to be replaced while we're coming up with a longer range plan to be able to replace that pump station, which the engineer is looking at.
Thank you for answering that. I also had questions about that pump station. I did notice, because I'm in the area, that it didn't seem to be running the other night. So I did see the electricity was pulled off of that building after the major flood on the 9th. So they had electricians back out. The pump was up and running, but in the last 2 days, it was due to a belt that had failed.
Sunday night, that's what I was told by one of the DPW foremen when he had North End Electric out there. They replaced the belt on. There's a smaller pump there that kind of runs all the time as that pit fills up, and then I believe the bigger one kicks on when the water gets to a certain level. So we're looking to see how it can, there's a light and a buzzer that goes off there, and now that nobody's living over in that area, nobody can call. And I know DPW director was out there several times over the weekend. He was checking on that pump, and it had been working properly, but sometime overnight, Sunday into Monday, the pump failed and wasn't able to keep up with the water because both of them were not running.
And now I noticed you had the one pump over there that day to pump that out over to Dewey. Last year, you've used several pumps over there as well. Now, last year, was the pump station running? You were just trying to supplement the pumping out, or was this an issue that was occurring last year as well?
I don't have that answer on what happened or occurred there last year. I'd have to check with the DPW director. He might have some information on that. But they had 2 pumps out there yesterday to pump that down to level to be able to get Lee Electric into the building, or excuse me, North End Electric and Urban in there to be able to make sure that everything was good. There was no electrical damage this time. It was a belt issue. It didn't get up over the electrical panels, so no electrical service needed to be done, but they're looking at alternative ways that we can get automated signals, which that's not something earth-shattering to be able to do. I know that there's a lot of sewer stations throughout the Abingtons and stuff that do the same type of thing as far as signaling.
Chief, if I heard you correctly before, so far, the assessment has been around $5 million. That doesn't include any of the homes that are more than likely, some of them, I mean, the couple that I've seen are more than likely going to be condemned. Will they ultimately be included in that overall assessment?
That will be under a different grant program. That will be if individual assistance, the individual assistance grant is able to be implemented. And it's not a real easy answer on how they determine. It's the 3 counties are in this disaster area. It's Luzerne, Wyoming, and Lackawanna County. They have a matrix that they'll put that in. That's why it was important when we were going out there and talking to the residents and had that mark that we had people uploading pictures, giving us what damage they had there. Now PEMA and FEMA will look at that and they put it into a matrix and it'll tell them likely to be approved for IA, unlikely to be approved, somewhat likely, or somewhat unlikely, and then they'll make a decision whether or not to ask for that.
So it's a 3-county request?
It is. It'll be the region when they look at the threshold that needs to be met. And, you know, we've heard numbers, 860 some properties, but it depends on the damage as far as whether it'll be likely that we'll be able to get the individual assistance grant and assistance from the federal government. So that's what we're waiting for right now. I think we're going to have more answers after PEMA and FEMA, who will have boots on the ground this weekend. PEMA has already been here. But once FEMA comes in and sees, you know, the pictures, we've been collecting pictures through our project management team. They've been working with the engineers to make sure that we're capturing all the damage as far as cleanup. All the directors have been capturing all the costs as far as any personnel or equipment costs related to our response to that flood. And right now we're just in the phase of actually doing the debris removal. Once that debris removal is done, if we do get that grant, hopefully it will open up that we'd be able to apply for mitigation, so permanent improvements in some of those creeks and streams and rivers further upstream. And, you know, our problem really here is in the city, we sit at the bottom of the bowl. Everything is flowing down to us. You know, so, you know, improper land management and planning above us is going to affect us. So what we might do right now to fix those solutions, if the other communities that are sending us that water through those rivers and tributaries don't do what they're supposed to do, those are going to eventually get overrun as well. So it's about having there's going to be some uncomfortable conversations that are going to be had.
Well, I think that's why we were looking at that regional stormwater authority. So
Couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think, you know, if there was ever evidence that all these other surrounding communities need to be involved, sadly, this, you know, disaster had to show glaring evidence of what happens if we're not all in this together and we all are responsible for stormwater mitigation. So I appreciate that.
Yep.
So Chief Judge, it seemed like you had a pretty good grasp on, and you might not know everything when it comes to it, but the condemnation process. Just while you're here, could you tell a family whose home has been condemned, what should they do? What steps should they take?
So, you know, some of the things that we've talked to them about at the different events that I've been to and what the code enforcement and OECD personnel have told them is, listen, we're still compiling that data, but in the interim, stop the damage right now. Like if you have sheetrock, we've told people, you know, remove that sheetrock that's wet, stop that mold infestation that might be gathering in there, clean out the basement, you know, protect the property that wasn't affected, make sure the home is secured, call your insurance company. I know that most insurance companies don't cover it, and unfortunately a lot of people that are sitting in a floodway or in a flood zone, which our maps indicate that, over the years they dropped the flood insurance. And, you know, I've talked to a couple residents about that. Now they have no flood insurance to be able to make those repairs or get any costs back. So the city's got to be very careful and very diligent, especially those homes that are in those flood zones, on what we permit them to be able to do, because it will affect other residences if we don't follow the guidelines as set forth. Because where we're at, we need that flood insurance program so that people are able to afford it. And that's getting tougher now because they've redone how they actually do the flood insurance. They have it's called Equity in Action, Risk Rating 2.0. But it raises rates significantly. Not if you already have it, but if you're buying a house that has one, your rates are going to be a lot more. National Flood Insurance Program pays out hundreds of millions more than it takes in. So it's a problem, and that's why they rely, and that's why the enforcement end from PEMA and FEMA, and they sent us a reminder, make sure you're doing these steps when it comes to those properties. You know, they sent us reminders, and I know the mayor has reached out, and she wants to set up a meeting with the city planner, with code enforcement, myself, and those FEMA officials, walk us through this process. But from the get-go, Tom Oleski and his crew, we've been making sure that we're very diligent about how we're going to go forward with that so that we're not affecting other homeowners who currently have flood insurance.
And those,
I'm
and those residents that are out of their homes at this point in time, any tips that you can give them on this permit process, or what they should be looking for, or
So the best thing they should do...
sit tight on certain permits while you can get these others?
Yeah, so what we're doing right now is, and here's the problem, if they're in that flood zone and they had, you know, substantial damage to their property above 50%, that's under the flood insurance program. It's going to require them to put the electrical panel on the first floor, to put the boiler on the first floor, put certain openings in their house, maybe raise it 1 foot above what they call the BFE, the base flood elevation. It becomes cost prohibitive for them to do that. But the ones that are maybe slightly or moderately damaged, that are under the 50% total damage or the threshold, you know, it's getting your contractors out there, getting the numbers together on what it's going to be, contacting code enforcement. I know that Tom Oleski, that's him and his staff, that's all they've been really dealing with the last 2 weeks, week and a half since this flood has occurred, is making sure that the homes that we know aren't above a 50% damage value, if they're able to, we're issuing the permits, so long as they pull those permits the proper way. We have the cost estimates. We've used Barry Isaac to go out there and do assessments on it. Don King has been involved. There's been a lot of departments in the city that have been involved to make sure that we are navigating that in accordance with our legislation and the National Flood Insurance Program. So it's a tough conversation, Councilman Schuster, and we wish we had more answers right now, but I'm hopeful that in the coming weeks, we're going to have more once we know which way we're going with the individual assistance. Because if the individual assistance doesn't open up, there are some other avenues. They're not going to be like the full value of the house or damages, but there's small business loans that they could put in, but we can't ask for that SBA right now until we make a decision on whether or not we're going to pursue IA. So once the county and PEMA officials decide if we're going to pursue the individual assistance, then if they say, no, we don't have enough, we put it into the matrix, they will open up a small business, an SBA here for low interest loans. And then the state also has a fund of money line item in their budget that's actually for those people that fall through the cracks if certain things don't happen. So we're hoping we're going to have a lot more information, but we're really waiting on state and federal government to give us more guidance. But, you know, we're in constant contact every day, and we're working this problem. We understand the pain that, you know, our residents that were affected by this flood are feeling. So the goal is to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
Do we know how many homes or how many residents are above that 50% damage threshold?
Code enforcement does, from the estimates from Barry Isaac, they do have some information on that. I don't have that in front of me right now, but yeah, from the estimates that came back from Barry Isaac and working with Don King on what the assessed value of the property is, I think they probably have a good hold at this point, because I think we've done a pretty good job of getting around to all the impacted areas in the city and making sure that we did our due diligence to make sure that we were capturing all that information. So,
Chief, I understand the sensitivity of the permits, and you explained that, you know, if we're not in compliance, that affects the national flood insurance, and it can affect everybody. So, I have a two-part question. So, first of all, mine's along the same lines as Councilman Schuster. People are reaching out to us, okay? Yes. They're like, hey, what can I do to bring my house back to being livable before we wait for, you know, the so-called buyout that might come down the road? So you said, you know, houses that are above 50% have been identified. Do the owners of them houses know that they've been identified? And if that's so, if they're above that 50%, then they're the ones that probably can't get permits, right? I need an example of a permit they shouldn't be able to get that could affect what you spoke of earlier with regards to, you know, an infraction with the National Flood Insurance Company. Like, I think the residents, the ones that are reaching out to us, they don't know these questions that Tom mentioned, and you're mentioning the 50%, and they're not aware of this. You know, and of course, it's a horrific situation they're in, but I just think they need more reassurance and more information like you're giving us, I think has to get out to them.
I know that code enforcement, when they are reaching out to code enforcement, Tom Oleski and the staff are pushing that information out, and I know that I spoke to several residents in the city at some of the marks and some of the other events and conveyed the same information that I've conveyed to you tonight. But code enforcement is really where that permitting process starts. I know that we've gotten several homes back online, restored the power to them. They might have only had, you know, flood and debris as far as mud in the basement, and maybe had to have an electrical panel pulled while they were doing that clean out. And, you know, some homes have been put back online. There are some that have not, but I know that when I was up at the Mark and Chinchilla, the code enforcement and, the OEC folks that were up there were reaching back down here to the city if they had questions about their specific property and whether or not we had done a damage assessment and evaluation of the cost. And my advice would be for them to reach out to code enforcement, and they will be able to provide more guidance. But I know when they reach out, code enforcement and Tom Oleski and Andrew Sunday have that information, and they've been flushing that out.
Sorry. God bless. Because we got, I can give you, for instance, we got an email that said, we reached out to Mr. Oleski to get permits to bring our house back up, electrical first. And they were told no. But then a day later, they called and talked to someone else in the department that told them they can get them. So, it's very confusing to these residents that are in this situation. So we need to be more consistent with the information, and because we're still getting emails and letters about it. So just so you're aware.
Would it be possible for the administration and maybe yourself and Tom Oleski and some of the people that are really working on this evaluation of the flooding and for these, especially for our residents who have been really affected? I mean, people basically lost their homes. Would it be possible to put together almost just like an information sheet, a bulleted sheet to say, step by step, here's the following things that you need to be mindful of. If you're trying to get back into your home, you need to go and apply for this permit, make sure that this is done, that is done. Just, so that like a step-by-step cheat sheet, I guess it would be, for people to access on our website maybe. I don't know. I don't think it would take too much, but put all those heads together and say, hey, listen, they can direct them to it. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, I would think it is. I would defer that to Mr. Oleski, but I know that they did put together 2 fact sheets and bulletins and send those to most of the impacted residents if they had contact information with them. So I know,
if they have it already, Chief, then
Yeah.
maybe we can take that, post it, and then put an announcement on our website. Say, listen, here's, questions, answers to questions you may have concerning flooding.
Yeah.
Boom, and at least they immediately can direct. Just
Yeah.
a thought.
I will reach out to Director Oleski and the mayor and the business administrator and pass that
And
on.
that may save Tom Oleski and some of the other departments from having to get a ton of calls all the time. If they, maybe all those questions can be answered and posted, and it would help relieve some of the anxiety. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people are struggling out there, so we appreciate everything that the Scranton Fire Department, DPW, Scranton Police, code enforcement, everyone has been doing to try to help our citizens through this incredibly difficult time.
Yeah, it's been a team effort across all departments in the city. Everybody has been involved, and there's been a lot of discussions back and forth. We're hopeful that we have more information to pass along to the residents, but we're kind of handcuffed at this point by PEMA and FEMA until they make their decision, but it's part of the process. I know it's not speedy and quick, but we're trying to get them as much information as we can, and we'll try and I'll talk to the mayor and the business administrator and Director Oleski about getting that up on the website.
Thank you, Chief. I think that we have some other speakers. I appreciate you coming in tonight and giving us that update. I think Matt Domines is here tonight with PFM to give us a financial update.
Thank you, Chief.
Sure. Thank you.
Push this on. It's awfully fancy for me. No, I'm good. I'm good, thank you. Yep.
Good evening, Council. Thanks for bringing us in. I just want to give an update. On the agenda is the borrowing for the taxes and borrowing for the $4 million. Tonight, we brought in Scott Shearer from PFM and Brian Koscelansky, who's the city's bond counsel. They're here to address any questions, really give an explanation. Scott has a presentation that he handed out to you to give you more background. We've been working with both Brian and Scott and Melissa from PFM really since July on this borrowing. So we're going to bring you up to date on where we've been through and the background of the borrowing here. And Scott, and we'll take some questions on that you may have.
Mr. Dodd, is this borrowing, is this the borrowing that came before us back in June 20th?
This is part of it. That was a notice that put on, lets the city extend for this capital borrowing to go back 90 days.
Yeah, that was the reimbursement resolution, and that was really just a tax code provision that allows, once you adopt that resolution, any money that you've spent on capital projects going back 60 days before that passage, you can reimburse those expenses when you do the borrowing. So it just gives that time frame to the extent you had to spend some money. It allowed us to recapture more capital projects that you were spending out of your general fund. But it's all tied together. That was just the first step in this process.
So you're here tonight to speak about that process?
Yes. And the ordinance that you have on first reading, last meeting, second tonight, and then hopefully third next week, that is the actual full borrowing resolution that's required by the Local Government and Debt Act to complete that process. But I'll let Scott go through the numbers.
Before we get started with what's on the agenda for tonight, back on the 20th of June, I asked some questions about this, and this is great that you're here in front of us for those questions. Can you just walk us through the process that occurred in June?
Oh,
so
sure.
we know where we're at for tonight.
When we first started looking at the best way to finance this on the cheapest basis for the city, and what we looked at was the tax code requires us, or only allows us to finance certain things on a tax-exempt basis. Otherwise, you have to do it taxable, which increases your rates and your borrowing costs during the term of the loan. So one of the things we typically look at is the city or any municipality, when you're looking at borrowing for what would otherwise be a taxable project, are there things we could finance tax-exempt and really just replace those dollars? We looked at with the city that the city was spending and has spent on capital items out of your general fund, during the course of this year, going into next year, monies from the general fund for those capital items. Those capital items we can finance on a tax-exempt basis at a cheaper cost. So really all we were doing was replacing those general fund dollars with the borrowing dollars so that then you can use those general fund monies to do other projects that we couldn't otherwise finance, including the repayment of court awards, other items of that nature. So it was really just a matter of finding the best way of getting that amount of money into the city at the cheapest cost. And that, I'm sorry, go ahead. And that reimbursement resolution really just kind of set that stage for, if you don't have a reimbursement resolution in place, when you do your tax-exempt borrowing, you cannot go back and reimburse yourself for capital costs that you may have spent. That reimbursement resolution allows us to set that time frame, and it goes back 60 days before that date. So when we look at all the money you spend on capital, we can go back to that date, count everything till we can get to closing, which on our current schedule is mid-November, or early to mid-November, recapture all of those dollars. Those go back to the city the day of closing. The balance of the funds gets spent on capital projects as you're doing those projects. So that was really just the first step to get as much time frame into that process as we could to recapture those costs.
Now, this $4 million and some change, is it specifically capital?
It has to be
projects?
capital items, yes.
Because I heard you say court awards. Is any of this money going to court awards? or
No,
is it
it's
all capital?
really, once again, we're just kind of substituting dollars that the city is expending for things that we could finance on a tax-exempt basis. So none of these dollars from a tax standpoint and from a documentation standpoint are being spent on anything other than documented capital projects.
So the city will be using the money to settle those, to pay those settlements from the actual, or from our budget.
General fund.
General fund.
Yes, like the previous payment that was made, right. And
Let me ask you this. If we weren't doing this $4 million borrowing, we wouldn't have the $4 million in the capital fund to be able to pay those, correct? Is that fair?
I mean, be sure you got the question right. If we weren't doing the borrowing, we'd be able to pay the court awards
Right.
from the general fund.
Correct.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. And the reason why we're going this route is because when you pull down from the general fund for these types of court awards, it's a hit to the fund balance. And the city just got their credit rating increased this past year. And one of the things they look at is the fund balance. And a large drawn down like that is a negative. So what we're doing with the capital, the way we're reimbursing the general fund is taking this money and it'll go into the general fund, but it'll be in a restricted account in the general fund, and it will leave pressure on the budgets next year. I've also worked with our auditor, Dan Seifert, who was here, so we can account for this next year. So next year, we're looking at probably putting into the budget a line item that would transfer money into the budget for a revenue that would be used for identified below capital projects. So it will come out of a special account so we can track it that way, so this money is only being expended on capital projects. So really what we're doing is this money will go into the general fund, but it'll be separated accounts. So that way when the rating agencies and the creditors look at it, they say, you dropped it down, but you did put money in there.
So the money we're borrowing can only be utilized for capital projects.
Correct.
Any other funds that are left over in the capital budget or within our existing budget can be utilized to pay off those settlement agreements.
The general fund balance.
Correct. General fund, right.
Right.
Excuse me, yeah.
We're not going to start drawing down on this account until we start doing some of these capital projects next year.
Well, what we can do as we get to move forward towards closing is one of the things we should do is identify capital items within that time frame of 60 days before the June date when we pass the reimbursement resolution, and reimburse the city for those costs that they spent with their general fund monies. It's easier from a tax standpoint because if it's all reimbursement, on the day that we close, that comes back to the city free and clear of any of the restrictions on capital borrowings going forward because you've spent those for capital items within that reimbursement period. So, and that may be, 500,000, it may be $1 million, it may be 200,000, but whatever that number is, it just makes sense to do that at closing. The balance of the funds will go in that separate account to be drawn down as you pay for capital projects going forward. Things that you are going to pay out of your general fund anyway.
I have a quick question.
What's the
Matt.
date of closing?
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's the date of closing?
November 8th.
November 8th.
So, does the city have insurance for any litigation settlements or awards?
Does the city have insurance?
Insurance, yeah.
I have to ask the legal office if we have insurance that covers these, but I don't think we do. That's why we're doing the borrowing. That would have to be something that I think I can ask Jessica, the solicitor.
Oh, would you get that answer from me, please?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So if you're okay, I will just kind of briefly go through this handout just to kind of let you know a little bit of the process that we went through. But I think between Matt and Brian, they summarized it real well. As we've been working on this for kind of many months, kind of looking at the interest rate market itself, kind of analyzing whether to use cash, whether to borrow, what kind of implications that may have on the credit rating. I think Matt made a very good point that with the increase in the city's credit rating back a couple months ago, that was kind of big news, getting us back into investment grade rating. We've been working with the city for quite a long time, and obviously that was great news. And the one thing that the credit rating agency kept pointing to was the liquidity, the available liquidity of the city, meaning the general fund balance. So something kind of newer that's been unfolding here over the past couple of years, and that was really the main catalyst for looking and ultimately moving towards the upgrade from the rating agency. And as Brian mentioned, I think was a great point, the goal here was to do a financing. So the interest rate market itself led our analysis to it's better to borrow, right? So then we said, okay, we're going to borrow, let's move forward with an RFP process with all the local banks to go for that. Then in discussions with Brian, it was how do we borrow the most efficient way? There's kind of different ways to do this kind of financing. And the way we have it here, the structure to pay for these capital projects, it allowed us to do this all on a tax-exempt basis, which obviously is what we want to do to get you the lowest overall interest rate over the life of the loan, as well as the lowest overall upfront cost. So we were kind of connecting all the dots here and doing the best overall financing that the city can do, and also protecting the credit rating as well, what's kind of best overall for the city's budget. So the handout that we went through, we do this kind of for all of our different transactions. We have it dated for October 3rd on the front cover. That would just be coincide with the third and final reading if you continue to move forward of the ordinance. But on page 2, just real briefly, we always show a couple different interest rate charts. But if you go to the middle page, or I'm sorry, the middle section on page 2, this is a tax-exempt index that we track closely for all of our financings, and it goes back to the early 90s. And basically the point of this, and there's all sorts of different facts and figures in that middle chart, but it's showing right now that we're still a little better than historical averages when we look at the borrowing costs. So that helped us in our analyses that the borrowing cost, which is what we care about here, is better, lower than historical averages, and the investment rate that we can get, whether it's on the city's general fund or whether it's on these borrowed proceeds, is higher than average. So that's good. So all the stars kind of connected and aligned that way. So from an interest rate perspective and overall market, things look real good. Then on page 3, so as I mentioned, we put out an RFP, a request for proposal, to a whole host of different local and regional banks. And on page 3 shows a quick summary of the responses that we received through that RFP process. So we got 7 different financial institutions that responded, varying interest rates. Some were fixed rates, some were variable rates, some had higher fees, some kind of all different. But at the end of the day, the row highlighted in yellow, row number 5, the proposal from M&T Bank, overall was the best financing. It was the cleanest financing. It had the best interest rate, the lowest cost, and it kind of checked all the boxes, and that's ultimately what we decided to move forward with in the ordinance. Now, the proposal came through at a 4.75%, and that changes based on kind of daily market movements. And so in talking to the bank, they were then able to lock that rate in shortly thereafter at a 4.85, so it wasn't the 4.75. The market actually had increased quite a bit more than that. The market increased probably closer to, I'd say, a 5% over the past week or so. But again, we were able to lock in, so it's set in stone to 4.85%. But again, overall, different responses from FNC, Fidelity, JP Morgan, M&T, Peoples, and PNC. And then we had a few others look at it and just decided to pass on it. But the M&T proposal was the cleanest. And then on the next page just shows a summary of how...
Can I ask why was it the cleanest? I noticed that it is the only one that is callable at any time. Was that a differentiator?
That's a big, well, number one, the interest rate was the lowest, so it's a fixed interest rate for the full term, and it was also the lowest. And it's also, again, prepayable at any time with no penalty. And we feel that's very important for your debt, that if, whether it's a year from now, 5 years from now, whatever the case may be, that if you have excess cash and your liquidity position looks good, you can take this debt off the books.
Or any portion of it as well, you could pay.
Or portion, yeah. So that's a very important piece, because over the years we have been able to pay down some of the city's debt through other means, and we always want to do it with the most efficient financings out there, meaning the ones that are callable at any time or past their call date. And so again, the M&T proposal from an interest rate, from a callability.
Can you tell us why the 4.27 by JP Morgan Chase doesn't beat the 4.7?
The 4.27 was non-callable, which means you can never pay it off. You can never refinance it.
Okay.
Yep. So that's kind of, again, that's sort of a big deal. Something that's very frowned upon in our industry, to have non-callable debt, because again, we want to make sure, and it gives you the ability to call it. It puts kind of all the leverage in your hands, not the bank's hands.
So that should interest rates drop,
you're able to refinance it.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Or if you need to restructure for some reason, you have that flexibility.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks. I just wanted, because if somebody's looking at this, they're
Yeah, no,
thinking,
great question.
You're just looking at interest rates, and there's lower ones on there, but there's reasons why they're lower.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, great question.
And I think one other item on the JP Morgan piece, if you look all the way over on the right-hand side, they were indicative rates, so they weren't locked in, and they probably have moved up over the
Quite a
last
bit.
couple of weeks as well. So this was at the time that they received the bids a couple of weeks ago, or the quotes at that time.
Thanks, Brian.
But yeah, that fixed rate is 4.85.
4.85,
It's changed
correct.
since the 4.75, but
That's
it's
right.
it's locked in from here till closing.
Locked in, yep, exactly. So then page 4 just illustrates how this debt fits in with your existing debt. So up top, kind of first in box number 1, The net proceeds basically going to be $4 million after you net out fees, and we'll get to that shortly. The term, it's basically a 9-year transaction. Settlement, November 8th. The structure is what we call a wrap structure, where we sort of wrap around the new principal around your existing debt. And the assumed tax status, again, tax exempt is what we really care about. So in column 4 is the annual debt service related to this loan. So that's the principal and interest in column 4, about $194,000 to $197,000 per year out through 2029. And then you see those bigger payments in 2030 and 2031. Well, then you got to look at to the left in column 3. Column 3 is all your existing debt right now that you're currently paying. And you see that substantial drop-off in your existing debt in 2030 and 2031. So the two pieces kind of fit together nicely in column 5 that now shows your total debt service. So one of the things that Brian and I have to do when we're structuring these transactions is obviously, number one, making sure we're complying with federal law, and that's, he already talked about that with the reimbursement resolution. So we need to make sure we comply with all the federal and IRS related items. And then we also need to make sure we comply with all the state rules and regulations. So this transaction needs to be approved down in Harrisburg at the state with the Department of Community and Economic Development. And so we need to make sure that when you look at your debt in totality, so your debt service payments on an annual basis for all of your outstanding issues, bank loans, bond issues, and the new one, that it has to either be level on an annual basis or decreasing. And so again, we have to not just look kind of myopically at this transaction, but we need to look at all your existing debt and make sure everything fits together nicely, and that's what's illustrated then in column 5. So it meets kind of all the state rules and regulations as well. And then on page 5, again, this will be updated with the final rate of 4.85, but this is the actual amortization schedule that will be paid back to M&T out through 2031, showing the principal and the interest, and then the annual payments as well. It's just kind of more the detail that fed back into that summary page from before. And then the next page is the sources and uses. So just to give you an idea of how things are going to be dispersed at closing. So under sources, we start with a note of $4,070,000. We have $4 million then available for projects, for capital projects only, and then fees for bond counsel, financial advisor, to the bank, and to the paying agent. And that we need to make sure the sources match the uses. And so this is a test for that. And again, showing that the closing would occur on November 8th if we keep with the schedule of second reading tonight, third and final reading next Tuesday. And then the next page is just your current, all your current bonds and bank loans, as well as then the new proposal from M&T here for the 2023 transaction in column 8. So again, just kind of shows more detail. And then the rest of this is just the actual proposal from M&T. So again, happy to answer any questions, but again, the highlight was first going down the decision path of pay cash or borrow. The financial markets dictated the analysis that more advantageous to borrow based on the environment that we're in right now. Then it's the road, how do we do it the most efficient in the borrowing, tax exempt, taxable. We talked about the structure of doing that to pay for these capital projects, and then also how this kind of fits in nicely with the narrative that the rating agency put in or put out there in their report for one of the big reasons for the credit rating upgrade. And that's extremely important to get the city back into the investment grade rating. It really does lower the cost of funds and gives the city a lot more opportunities in the future to refinance debt or secure other debt in the lowest cost possible. And with the outlook that the rating agency gave the city, you got bumped up to investment grade, BBB-, which is great, but then they also put on a positive outlook, which means that if the liquidity position of the city, meaning general fund reserves, stays strong, not necessarily excessively strong, just kind of in the same trajectory that you've been going the past couple of years, there's a chance for maybe even another upgrade, possibly next year as well. So kind of taking all that into account is how the team approached this financing and ultimately led to the ordinance before you last week, tonight, next week.
The liquidity point that Scott pointed out is why we're doing the borrowing, because we'll be drawing down the general fund balance to pay these lawsuits. But bringing in the money from the borrowing even though that will decrease our liquidity, but when we bring the borrowing in, that brings us back up to a liquid point. So that is kind of offset for the S&P when they take a look at it.
And just from a quick procedural standpoint, if we go ahead with the second reading tonight, we do have to advertise before the third reading. That advertisement is over with the paper, and that's good for 30 days if there's any hiccups. Once it's finally adopted, there's a second ad that goes in the paper. We have some paperwork to sign. That goes down to the state for a 30-day review period, essentially, which gets us to that closing in the beginning of November. So that's why it takes a while. And also one of the reasons for the reimbursement resolution, recognizing that it takes several months to put all of this in place and do the bank RFPs, and you wanted to get that timeline and recapture as much as you could.
So Brian, if this passes under sixth order tonight, then it gets tabled for 30 days?
No, it doesn't get, you can do tonight's reading, next week's reading for final enactment. It's just the state has a 30-day review period, so we have to get all of that to them. We can't close within that period.
Gotcha.
So
And
you
that-
follow.
That can't happen until we pass it in seventh order.
Right, that starts the clock running.
Exactly.
Gotcha, okay.
ACD
And then we have to put a second ad in the paper. That takes a couple days to get the proof back and things like
Okay, I
that.
was
So-
a little confused there, I thought for a
No,
second.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
No, you follow your normal process, but then the state has theirs, and it gets us a little bit of a delay between when you finally adopt and when we could actually close.
Thank you. Do any other council members have questions?
Last question. So M&T is just taking a $5,000 fee. They get a $5,000 fee. PFM is our financial advisor on the deal, and Brian is our bond
Yes,
counsel.
I think that's for the bank's counsel.
Yeah, the M&T fee of $5,000 is for their legal counsel to review the documents. Yep.
Yeah, one way too, looking at this too, is, this money, when we do we're doing the budget now, the 2024 operating budget, but some of the capital projects that are always included into the budget sucks up a lot of the revenue on our revenue side. This way here, as I mentioned before, we're working with the auditor to put a line item into next year's budget that will show this money coming in. So we have $2 million in projects or capital projects that this money will come out of that account to borrowings. It'll be probably something like 2023 capital financing, and then capital projects like paving down below. So that'll pull some of the money away from the revenues that are coming into the budget. So this way, it'll be like a year or two where we can offset some of those costs from the borrowing, but it kind of gives us a little bit more breathing room onto the revenues coming into the city, because they won't be going for these capital projects.
We'll be able to earn some interest on that as well over that time?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, on the money, yeah.
Okay,
It'll be set up separate, so similar to the debt service account.
Great.
In Fidelity, the way the debt service, and you see the debt service for next year is $194,000, and we'll include that into next year's budget as part of the total debt service. I have the rest of the debt service in the budget preparation I'm doing now, so this will just be included in there.
And hopefully with where short-term rates are and your general fund rates and returns, hopefully as that money sits there, it'll be pretty much as an offset. So
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
great. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for coming in this evening.
you're welcome.
I think Mr. Schuster has one more question. Nope. It sounds like we have several questions.
Borrowing like this, has ever been done in the city before? Is there any other precedents prior to this, or is this the first time
You mean tax
a
exempt
transaction is?
We've done capital borrowings and tax-exempt borrowings over the years. We've done refundings, capital borrowings. So there were a bunch of bond issues, publicly offered bond issues, also we've done bank loans for the city as well. So it is a very routine process from the actual debt side of it. It's not dissimilar from even the pension deal that you did a couple of years ago when we borrowed associated with that. Now that's all been paid off, but the process was the same.
And then I just wanted to clarify real quick. So you're saying with regards to the investment grade that it's, this isn't going to hurt or help that grade, correct?
No, we're looking at this as the borrowing is helping.
As helping.
Kind of, like I said before, is, the drawdown for paying the court awards is kind of looked at as a negative, because you're drawing down the fund balance. And this is really, so when S&P looks at it, they'll say, well, there's this here, but the city amortized that expense over the long term with the capital borrowing, and kept their fund balance, they kept their liquidity.
And just in general, settling the litigation is a big positive as well. It's now a known liability, and it's going to be off the city's books as well. So kind of twofold way to look at it.
And that's a good point, because that liability, affects the credit rating. You know, as we've been bringing down, the city's been bringing down their liability on settling lawsuits, especially the earned income tax was a big one. That was a tough nut to crack, because there was a big liability for the city if that went all the way through the process and they lost. You know, so that was, well, I think it was probably like $24 million.
Yeah.
It was up there in
Yeah,
cost.
very
So
large.
when you bring them down, S&P looks at that, they always look at their outstanding liability. So the smaller liabilities we have in lawsuits that are outstanding out there, the better it is for our credit rating. Because that, again, they don't see the liquidity, it maintains the liquidity. There's no future on the horizon risk of a lawsuit draining that liquidity, because there's no big lawsuits out there.
Okay, thank you.
Make sense?
Thanks again, gentlemen, appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Have a nice night.
Have a good evening.
You too.